from the news capital of the world. You've landed on the Daily Objective from the Ayn Rand Center UK. And what a day. Normally where you would have the collective, we've got breaking news. And we bring you, I believe, history's largest network of information and entertainment inspired by objectivism, always focused on living and living our best lives, but also, taking abreast of what are the day's headlines and trying to apply Miss Rand's philosophy to those headlines. And today's headlines are all about actions here within the US, about the US Supreme Court. And aren't we lucky? Usually lawyers charge in every 6-minute increments and often hundreds of dollars an hour. But we've got an attorney, I believe a former federal prosecutor as well. Correct, James?
Oh, former state prosecutor. Yeah.
Prosecutor as well.
James
Valliant, author of numerous books on objectivism, a terrific objectivist and scholar in his own right. We have him with us today to help unpack the news about the Supreme Court. Thank you, James.
Oh, my pleasure, Jonathan. Yeah, it's kind of a good day, I think, for the decision that was announced today on affirmative action.
Let's start right to it. I mean, here's the headline: Supreme Court rejects affirmative action at colleges as unconstitutional. They ruled on Thursday that the affirmative action admissions policy of Harvard and the University of North Carolina, as we said, are unconstitutional. It's a massive blow to decade-old effort to boost enrollment of minorities in American universities through policies that took into account applicants' race. Eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it, wrote Chief Justice John Roberts, with the majority of opinion, his conservative fellow justices chiming in. This is a big thing, James. This is going to change millions of dollars in terms of allocation of assets and, thousands and thousands of young people's admissions decisions.
Yes, absolutely. There's really no question that, for example, Harvard was discriminating against Asian students on the basis of race. There was racial discrimination, and not only racial discrimination, but against a group, a racial minority that had been discriminated against traditionally, historically, and legally in this country. And so Harvard was acting in a racist way in their admissions policies against Asian students getting in. There's really no question about that. But from an objectivist standpoint, we might ask ourselves, why the heck is government involved in the admission policies of what should be private institutions like universities? Can't private institutions like universities engage in racial or sexual discrimination, even with the 14th Amendment? I mean, there are traditionally Black colleges. There are traditional women's colleges, Bryn Mawr. Can't those institutions say, we're providing a service? And that justifies our discrimination because we're private universities, we're private institutions. And yeah, on an objectivist standpoint, private institutions should be free to discriminate any way they like. The reason why this comes under the 14th Amendment and why it is, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted after the Civil War to protect the rights of freed Black slaves. And it said that state governments cannot discriminate. They have to provide the equal protection of the laws to everybody. And government has subsidized, in effect, university customers for many years now through Pell Grants, guaranteed student loans, a variety of other programs, along with huge research grants and all kinds of other subsidies to universities. And so the courts have said, no, they're in effect a quasi-government agency. There are certain universities like Hillsdale College, for example, a religious school, that rejects all such subsidies and therefore can discriminate in any number of ways and violate a whole host of government regulations. So that's sort of the summary of how we got here. About 40 years ago, there was a case that talked about affirmative action, but it was a mess. The Bakke decision, Bakke and University of California, way back then, it was a 4-4-1 split decision that really didn't make a clear decision. They could take race into account in their admissions policies. And that's what has sort of been the regime of the last 40 years. You can't be overtly quota, you can't have numerical quotas. On the other hand, you can take into account race. This decision today wipes that all away, says universities cannot use race as a filter as such. It can take race into account only in the individual history of college applicants. So, for example, if you, Jonathan, had been discriminated against in the course of your education, say, you could say, hey, I faced discrimination, or I had to overcome discrimination in the neighborhood I lived in, ... In that sense, on an individual case-by-case basis, they can, but they can't say, weight it against Asians as Harvard has been doing.
Well, we're getting tremendous response from our super chatters, Jim. They're the ones that keep us on the air. As we said, we bring you a show every day with really some of the brightest minds, people like James Valliant. I mean, Don Watkins is on our network, Harry Binswanger, true objectivist scholars and teachers. And Michael Sweet, thank you for your contribution. Adherent of Lady Columbia says that this day should be marked for victory. You agree?
I agree. I think it is a major victory. Permitting the government to engage in racial discrimination is what the previous regime's principle had been really allowing. It's a funny thing with the 14th Amendment. It is only now that we're really beginning to get a consistent application that says the government can't be racist. They allowed it was Jim Crow for 70 years. They allowed legal laws that discriminated and segregated races. Separate but equal is okay under Plessy. Not until 1954 did we get Brown versus Board of Education, which tossed that out the window. But it's still later, the affirmative action cases still permitted some government racism. Today marks the end of that. Formally and officially, in one sense. The 14th Amendment requires government institutions not to use race in any decision-making capacity.
The irony is, our super chatters are celebrating. Bonnie Bertrand, thank you. She says, good news at last. Adherent of Lady Columbia says, enough collectivist tears to build a hydro dam. Also contributing as well. I mean, I don't know if you could say the irony, Jim, but, we always talk about, ideas are what fuel the culture. I think it's probably what fuels policy as well. And, look at some of the justifications from the, as you'd say, liberal members of the Supreme Court. Justice Sonia Sotomayor said, today this court stands in the way and rolls back decades of precedent and momentous progress. She called the ruling profoundly wrong and devastating. She said it cements a superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in an endemically segregated society where race has always mattered and continues to matter. So Justice Sotomayor says, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, but she's saying, look, you're saying you're being colorblind in a society where race matters and it continues to matter, and thus government has a role. What say you?
She's the one defending racism. She thinks it's okay for Harvard to continue to discriminate on a racist basis. She's defending racism, point blank. And more than that, she is a racist against Blacks and Hispanics. She believes they require government help. She thinks it isn't a cultural issue that perhaps keeps them behind, but institutional issues, institutionalized racism. Well, this is institutionalized racism. She is defending institutionalized racism and the principle of institutionalized racism. So she's got it all backwards. She is the primordial defender of collectivism and tribalism. She thinks government programs can be racist, and that there's no other way. She's defending ugly, ugly racism. There's no other way to look at it. The definition of racism has been so torn out of any kind of real meaning and twisted into pretzels by the left that it no longer means what it really is.
And now you have the anti-racist thing, which is talk about doublespeak, anti-racist. So, thank you for pointing it out and having the courage to point it out. Brad Becker, super generous contribution, $50 US. Thank you so much, Brad. Brad says, thank you for these insightful podcasts. Jim Valliant, you're such a big part of all of our podcasts. So we thank you on behalf of Brad, and I know our audience thanks you. We thank you, Brad, as well. Wyatt asks, isn't this because Hillary didn't appoint 3 justices? Was this a kind of a lucky stroke, Jim, that, Hillary didn't get more voices on the court, more liberal voices on the court that would have overturned this?
Well, it's hard to predict the way justices will go, especially Hillary's would have gone. I think it's hard to, but I want to remind everyone that last year, Trump's appointments meant the end to the right for a woman to have an abortion, even in the first trimester, even a pre-viable fetus, she's got to carry to term. And we're now beginning to see the horrible consequences of that. So I would have to say that the difference between conservatives and liberals is such on constitutional issues these days that when the conservatives take over, we'll get better decisions. And I mean that in a comparative way, because, really it's compared to what we're talking about here. We'll get better decisions in some categories and worse decisions in other categories. I happen to think abortion is an extremely fundamental and important thing. And so I grieved last year when the right to an abortion was taken away from women. And so I think we have to take it, balance it out here. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get people like me, I don't mean to be immodest, on the Supreme Court who could be consistent about individual rights across the board?
Well,
Unfortunately,
something like racism, we all seemingly should be able to understand that racism is bad. And, read Miss Rand's definition of racism, her article about racism. It's not a very lengthy read. Jim, she refers in one of my favorite passages as racism as a barnyard mentality. And isn't it? I mean, you're looking at a group of kids, you're saying, well, here's 2 brown cows and here's 2 white cows. We don't want the brown cows, we want the white cows. And isn't that like looking at rational human beings like animals, like barnyard animals? Miss Rand?
No, you're breeding pigs or dogs or something. Or humans, and it eradicates what makes you, as Ayn Rand brilliantly points out with that observation, it eradicates the difference that between humans and other animals. We have a mind, we have choice, we have a rational faculty which distinguishes us, makes us individuals. I mean, individualism uniquely applies to humans because of our rational faculty. Racism eradicates that, any consideration of that. It's one of these things that says that judges people on non-volitional, something they can't choose. You can't blame me for being white and born in the 20th century. I had no choice about that, Jonathan. It just simply makes no sense to morally evaluate someone on that basis or to discriminate on that basis. Individuals are individuals. They're not statistics in any event. When we start treating individuals like statistics, terrible injustice must accrue. It must. It must. Yeah. So today's victory is a victory in effect for individualism. I'm going to put it that strongly.
Rand has a quote as well. I mean, I don't remember what era it's from. I guess it's probably from the 70s, in which she said, in effect, I'm paraphrasing, the biggest perpetrators of racism today are those, something effective like who were the victims of the racism in the past. I forgot exactly what it was. Maybe one of our super chatters, Robert, thank you for your super chat. We'll pick it up. But I guess it's just so frustrating, James, to see that what we would understand as being racist, judging and evaluating people based on the color of their skin, why is that seen as morally good now? I feel like when I was growing up in kind of the 80s and 90s, we understood that that was bad, that a colorblind society, that is, I understood that as judging people, in Dr. King's words, on their actions and their character, the content of their hair, not their skin. But now it's like the other way is back in. Now what's cool is judging people by their skin. And where they fly on that intersectionality element is what gives them moral standing in the world.
No, we're institutionalizing tribalism. We're institutionalizing this groupthink that says the groups to which you belong are all important and overwhelming. No, Jonathan. It's not the groups to which you belong that make you a value, or any other individual that makes them a value. It's not because they're a woman or white or gay or straight. It's their mind. It's the contribution of their individual creative mind, the things that make them an individual. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and you're absolutely right. What's happened is terrible. My father was a Goldwater Republican. My mother was a Kennedy Democrat, but both of them agreed with Martin Luther King. People should be judged on the basis of their individual character, not on the color of their skin. What the hell has happened to America, where we're now accepting collectivism, whereas before it had been generally the consensus that racism was wrong and abhorrent? It's terrifying development.
Yeah, I mean, and we've always talked about, too, the importance of self-esteem. It can't be faked. It can't be bought. It can't be, deceived or evaded. And, I always wonder, the so-called beneficiaries of affirmative action, how much really self-esteem can you feel knowing that you achieved something, even in part on the basis of something that you had zero part of?
Can I tell you a personal story? A good friend of mine at the district attorney's office, a fellow prosecutor of mine, African-American, one of the most amazing men I've ever known. He was an Army Ranger, special forces. The guy is as badass as anyone I've ever known. He was also a really good lawyer, and he became a judge. And he would privately, and I mean very privately, comment to me. It's like people think and just assume that I got into law school because I'm Black, or people assume that I became a prosecutor because I was Black, or became a judge so every achievement he has in his life, he's going to have to look over his shoulder because of affirmative action and say, are people really recognizing my individual merit, Or are they saying, oh, yeah, well, he got ahead. He became a prosecutor and a judge because he's black. That's horrible, isn't it?
I mean, it is. It's one of the reasons I said, I mean, I just think of, let's just say in the political world, some of the African American politicians who I knew and appreciated in like the 90s and 2000s. I won't bother naming any, but you knew these people had the stuff. They were the real thing. It wasn't a comment on anyone's skin. It was completely their skills, their accomplishments, and their achievements. And I would put that with Barack Obama as well. I mean, say what you want about Barack Obama. He was an accomplished man and deserving of the presidency in that sense. And I want to ask Brad at a super great contribution once again. Thank you, Brad, really hitting us out of the park today and helping keeping this programming on the air. Brad wants to know, in our opinion, is this new woke racism merely a slump in the timeline of Western culture, or is it going to continue to drag us down with it?
That's the question, isn't it? We are heading Ayn Rand was prescient. I mean, her ability to foresee this thing. She saw, in an age when people saw racism is going out in the 60s and 70s, she foresaw the rise of tribalism. And indeed, recent decades have unfortunately borne out her sad prophecy. Now, that is the question. Will this kind of ugly tribalism, this primordial tribalism, this barnyard mentality, as Jonathan calls it, will it continue and accelerate? That's the direction we're heading in. Or will a philosophy of reason and individualism counter that and get people back to reality? That's the question.
There's always that effort, Jim, to, look, this is one place, actually, let me follow up with this. This is a decision that was made in government. And one of the liberal justices' objections was basically, look, you change it in government and it doesn't change it in real life. So what a bit about that? I mean, is there something to be said here that just because you eliminate this element of racism from federal law, that racism still exists in real life? And we know that is wrong.
It is. And if people are allowed to be free, as Ayn Rand pointed out, the rational will tend to prevail. It is government that has kept racism going through things like Jim Crow laws and things like that. When people step away, look, if a baker, whether it's gays or blacks that he doesn't want to bake cakes for, he's putting himself at a competitive disadvantage. He's cutting off a whole class of customers. And the guy across the street who'll take any customer is going to have a competitive advantage. If you indulge the irrational, you're going to pay a competitive price for it. When humans are left free, do we have institutional racism anymore in this country? No, we have, institutional anti-racism in this country. We've elected a black president. We have had multiple blacks on the Supreme Court. Republicans, conservatives from the South can elect a senator like Tim Scott, the very heart of the old Confederacy. No, racism as an effective force in our country is no more. In that sense, if there are economic disparities, they are provably not the result of racism. Professor Thomas Sowell has demonstrated this decades earlier. Why would, for example, first or second generation African Americans from Africa do about the national average, whereas if your grandfather came from the American South, you're doing so much poorer? It's not a racial thing, and it's not the result of race, and it's not the product of any racial difference. It's obviously a cultural difference. And until and unless we address that, and that's something government can't fix, Jonathan.
I guess, I mean, that's just the frustrating part is that these efforts to encourage racism, I don't know the Justice Brown's first name, Ketanji Brown. Ketanji Brown. She said the ruling was a tragedy for us all. She happens to be African American as well. So that's what I think is so frustrating, Jim, is, people act not based on what's best for their pocketbooks. They act based on what they believe is right. They believe it's morally right. And what has turned around now that among seemingly lots of young and old people, the idea of evaluating folks based on their skin color is seen as legit.
And coming from an African American woman who was heavily involved in education from the academic world. I mean, here it's, can you imagine something that perverse?
We're not using race as a factor in making decisions.
Right.
Backward as hell.
It's perverse. It's like Ayn Rand's analogy. You see a mother bird tearing the wings of her baby out. I mean, here you've got an African-American woman heavily involved in the academic world defending racism. That's as perverse as I can think.
Yeah, well, now we want to also get to our other story today, which was a bit about the student loan forgiveness. Basically, this is another big Supreme Court decision. It's imminent. It's coming anytime soon. Could come as early as Friday, ruling on President Biden's plan or attempt to basically give everyone, under certain thresholds, of course, $20,000 free dollars off of their student loan payments. Now, this is seemingly a complete giveaway, right? I mean, it's like you literally get a check from $20,000 with Joe Biden's name on it to pay towards your student debts. The government's going to be ruling on this one as well. You know, for Jim, a lot of people, that is their biggest debt. One of their biggest debts is their student loan debt. So, you know, what do you expect from the ruling? And, you know, knowing that government is so involved in every element of education, you know, should we be for it because we get the money back, or should we be against it because it inculcates government more in student loan financing?
Well, you know, on an individual basis, I would cite people to Ayn Rand's great article on the question of scholarships. And there she said, on an individual basis, take advantage of these government programs. You're getting back what they at least some of what they coercively took from you in the first place. But she also said something very interesting. She said, the only people who really are morally qualified to accept the government programs, whether it's Social Security or a scholarship, are people who oppose the program. And here I would have to agree with her. We need a separation of education and government, just as we need a separation of church and government, church and state, and for the same reason. As Ayn Rand also would have said. So we need to get the hell government out of this altogether. Funny, that's what gave government, as we were in the earlier case, the right to regulate admissions policies on the part of government. Now, what do I expect? I expect a good decision here as well. Here the issue, though, is presidential power. The Constitution requires no money can be appropriated from the United States Treasury except with the approval of Congress. Full stop. It is Congress that has power of the purse strings. It is the House of Representatives and the Senate, first the House and then the Senate, that have to do this under our Constitution. Hundreds of billions of dollars in spending without any congressional approval is a power grab by the executive, in my view. Not only that, the Congress just passed a bipartisan bill, and Biden vetoed it, trying to prevent Biden from doing this. So against the will of Congress, he's going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, which was not authorized under the original bill.
But isn't that, there's a moral authority about it, right? He seems like a good guy. You know, he's trying to help everyone out with education. Jim, this isn't for cigarettes and 40s. This is education, you know? So that's what I'm saying. What's so frustrating is like, we could all say, you know, Nazis are bad, but, oh, it's education. You know, you're just a mean, you know, you don't care about people hurting. Isn't
that very compassion that has fueled these subsidies, and these subsidies are what's behind pricing the middle class out of university education affordability. The thing that keeps, I mean, normally in the free market, prices will go down. Television, smartphones, computers, you name it. Sure, only rich people can afford it. But as the time goes by, down come the prices. Why? Two things: medical care, medical services, and education have been striking exceptions to that. Why? Because of the damn government subsidies. And all that compassion has now made it unaffordable for most people. Isn't that lovely? And think about this. Factory workers and truck drivers, through higher inflation or through their taxes, now have to subsidize the university education of someone who wants to get, you know, a liberal arts education in communist studies or whatever else it is out there, and they're supposed to pay for it? Really? No, I think most Americans, what's really interesting on this issue is that it really helped bring out, people do oppose this, and it's really striking to see the justice that I've finally heard for the first time about a government program. People saying, hey, there's something fundamentally unjust about taking money from this guy to subsidize this person's university. Yeah, we all have a right to a university education. At whose expense? At whose damn expense do you have a right to a university education? Wouldn't it be lovely if we could all get university educations for our children? Well, of course. But they don't grow on trees any more than heart surgery grows on trees.
Yeah, well, 14 years ago, there was a similar collectivist mentality around subsidizing mortgages that had gone belly up. Is it that we're all in it together? We're all best if we have an educated population is in everyone's interests. But I know, Jim, I deal with a lot of people and their families and money. It's very frustrating to see young people who've spent well into six figures on an asset that is an education that isn't really saleable, isn't really marketable, and got a below market loan that the private market, that is the real market, would have never given them.
Never have given them in the first place. But my wife and I both went to university, and we both paid. I went to law school too, and we both paid off our student loans. We figured it was an obligation. When we agreed to pay it back, we figured it was an obligation that we were taking on. We didn't expect the government to come along and say, you don't have to pay. No. It's bad on moral grounds from many dimensions, if you think about it. It encourages responsibility. And a lot of these government these degrees are worthless, and we're subsidizing the absolute worthless kinds of educations too. There's no way to discriminate in quality when the government is handing things out indiscriminately like that too. It's a bunch of garbage.
Theme master, tame master, thank you so much for that contribution. And just say, Jim, in effect too, it's like, what a time in which, the supposed evil big tech has made, if you're actually interested in an education, lectures from the best lecturers and minds in the world available from your phone or from your desktop, literally for free. So if you want to be educated, we live in an unprecedented time in which the world's intellectual treasures are literally at your fingertips.
Absolutely. We're living in a science fiction age. We really are. In my hand, I can hold most of the knowledge that humans have ever accumulated. And online university educations these days, the Ayn Rand University, Ayn Rand Institute, I would encourage serious students of objectivism to check that out. And of course, what we do here at the Ayn Rand Center UK, I think, is an important part of that. We are, in fact, providing all kinds of educational content and current affairs content like no one else. So please, folks out there, do consider becoming a subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. I think we're doing important work here, and if you agree, then consider value for value here and becoming a subscriber.
Couldn't have said it any better. And Richard appreciates all of your contributions, James. He says, one small victory for individualism. Thanks for the great content. I hope James writes another book. And as a fan of your previous works, I would agree with that.
Thank you.
But don't change that YouTube channel, because coming up at 10 p.m. UK tonight, Life on Earth with Robert Nasir on The Boy in the Bicycle, the courage to face a lifetime. And, Ms. Rand always talked about, philosophies or objectivism as a philosophy for living on Earth. And I love that. Robert always emphasizes life on Earth, making the most of it, enjoying it, not strewing about political things and being woke and all that. Really great tools for living and enjoying your life. So we'll be tuning in at 10.
Absolutely.
And thank you, Jim.
Everyone heading to Ocon and Miami, have a great time. It's I know that's starting, and Independence Day is coming up, and happy 4th, everyone.
Yeah, happy 4th. Celebrate freedom, celebrate individualism. Thank you for supporting us. Pick up something of Ayn Rand, a short essay, one of her larger novels. Take this opportunity over the holiday weekend to avail yourself of America's preeminent philosopher, Ayn Rand, and we're happy to support her work, and so happy that we have so many of you supporting us well. So keep it tuned here, like, share, everything that you do, what you do. And as James said, thank you for supporting us on a monthly basis as well. We will see you next time, tomorrow, same time for the Daily Objective. Until then, keep it tuned for Life on Earth. Wishing you best premises. Be well.